At the GMU Econ Society, we organize lecture series, discussion sessions, and other interactions between professional economists and students. If you'd like to learn more about the Econ Society, please come speak to me or any of the other officers that are up here in the front at the end of the lecture. This semester, we have already hosted Michael Munger, and we will have Dan Smith, who actually received his PhD at George Mason in November. And in the back, if you're in Betke's class, you can sign in to receive the extra credit. And also, the GMU Econ Society is holding a fundraiser at Panda Express. So if you grab one of the flyers and go get food on Thursday there, then you'll be supporting us. So tonight we have Stephen Horwitz, a Charles A. Dana professor of economics at St. Lawrence University in New York. He completed his MA and PhD in economics at GMU and received his AB in economics and philosophy from the University of Michigan. He's the author of 2 books and has written extensively on Austrian economics, Hayekian political economy, monetary theory and history, and macroeconomics. In addition to several dozen articles in numerous professional journals, he has also done nationally recognized public policy work on the role of private sector during Hurricane Katrina for the Mercatus Center, where he is an affiliated senior scholar. The author of numerous op-eds, Horwitz is a frequent guest on TV and radio programs, particularly on the Great Recession and monetary policy. His current research is on the economics and social theory of the family, and he is at work on a book on classical liberalism and the family. Thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the lecture.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you guys for coming. It's always easier to come when there's free pizza, and pretty good, decent Domino's pizza at that. So I said free, I should have said zero price. I'm sorry. Let's see how long my clicker lasts. My battery is low, so you may see me bouncing back and forth tonight. Well, what I want to do, I hope, in the next, I'm going to talk for maybe 50, 55 minutes, maybe a little less. We'll see how it goes. What I want to do is kind of construct an argument that classical liberalism, and you can use libertarianism in your head if you want to, though I'm going to use classical liberalism because I'm going to talk about some of the history. And certainly when some of this history was happening, no one used that word libertarianism. Rather, they used the term classical liberalism to refer to that sort of combination of a belief in both free markets, but also freedom to choose within the social realm. And importantly, as we'll talk about, part of classical liberalism of that time was an opposition to imperialism and the sort of military war making and so on. And what I want to try to argue is that classical liberalism historically was a form of progressivism, and that in particular, or in addition, that even today one can construct an argument that modern classical liberals, if that's not a contradiction in terms, libertarians today, we would probably use that word, have a claim to progressivism, have a claim, if we want to articulate our arguments that way, have a claim to being on the left politically. And normally we think about libertarians as being on the right. Another way to put this, perhaps, is I want to make a case for what's been in the last couple, 3, 4 years called bleeding heart libertarianism. Okay? And if you're not familiar with that term, there's a wonderful blog, not just because I'm one of the bloggers there, it is a good blog, called bleedingheartlibertarians.com. If you go bleedingheartlibertarians.com, you'll find it. You can Google that term. You'll certainly find the blog, and there's lots of interesting things going on there. And so what I want to argue, again, is that libertarians, that people who believe in free markets, but also free minds and freedom of choice in general, should more consciously attempt to think of themselves as on the political left rather than the political right. Some libertarians say libertarians should be neither. We're not left or right. And I understand that, okay, and I get it, right? They want to disassociate themselves from the problems with both of those two groups. But what I also want to argue is that, well, as true as that is, history suggests that we have a claim, at least, to being thought about as part of that left progressive movement. And to do that, you have to get out of your head the sort of policies that we tend to associate with that movement today, particularly in terms of the economy, and think about a bigger question of what do we mean by progressive and how might we make that argument for the progressivism of libertarianism. As I do that today, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to take a detour into, as we look at the history, take a detour to ask a question that doesn't often get asked enough, which is, how progressive were the progressives, and particularly the progressives of 100 years ago? But the overarching theme is, who is really on the side of the poor? Who is really on the side of, say, African Americans or women? Who really is on the side of innocent victims of American imperialism? And I'm going to try to argue that historically, classical liberalism was on the side of those groups, and so was libertarianism in the 20th century for much, though not all, of its history. And I'm going to argue that we should see ourselves as being on the side of those groups, and that we need to recapture that spirit of progressivism. And part of this argument, and this I think for students, for college students, undergraduate college students, is particularly important. I think it's important that people who believe in classical liberalism today, libertarians today, not allow anyone else, but particularly our friends on the left, to claim a monopoly on the moral high ground. They don't get one, okay? It should be the case that we as libertarians also care about the least well-off among us. And we believe, I hope anyway, libertarians believe that our preferred social order would do better by them than the alternatives. That is, we believe that free markets and a free society would do better for the poor, for African Americans, for women, whatever group we want to put in there. And libertarians need to be unafraid to push back when leftists accuse libertarians of not caring about the poor or being racist or being sexist because of our policy preferences. We should not let them get away with arguing in bad faith that way. Most of our disagreements with people on the left, I want to argue, but not all of them, most of them, are not about the ends, not about the goals, but about the means, about how we get there. It's not that we don't care and they do. We both care. We just differ on what sorts of policies will get to those goals most effectively. And I think it's important to sort of continually make that point, that the disagreement is, again, mostly, not all, about means, not about ends. The discussion we should be having in the United States today is about the effects, the empirical effects of different policies, not which group's motives are more pure. I just happened to hear on the news today, this morning I actually saw it while I was walking by a TV somewhere. Tomorrow night, of course, is round 2 of the great slugfest between the two brilliant candidates. And what I saw on TV was that Obama is going to unleash a new character attack against Romney. Because with 8% unemployment and a really ratty economy, that's what the president should be concerned with, right? Is what next character attack he can roll out on Mitt Romney, and same the other way, right? We're not talking about the issues. We should be talking about the issues and not accusing other people of having the wrong views on X, Y, or Z in the sense of that, what's he going to say? Romney is an elitist, he's a racist, or whatever thing Obama's going to pull out. That's not what the conversation should be about. So to sort of see this and to kind of understand where all of these issues are coming from, okay, I want to kind of go backwards in time and take a look back at why, where these ideas came from and why they are what they are. So one question, again, to think about is, why is classical liberalism often thought to be on the right? Our heritage, as I'm going to argue, is a progressive one. And one of the last points I want to make today is that the issues of the 21st century are starting, I think, to realign things. And those of us interested in free markets and libertarianism need to capture, take this moment and recapture that progressive spirit as our own. We'll see if we can do that. So in the 19th century, what was classical liberalism about? Making the case that classical liberalism, especially the defense of free markets, was considered progressive isn't really that hard, right? In the 19th century, our intellectual ancestors were the ones on what today would be called the progressive or left side of these topics. The classical liberals of the 19th century were, as it were, the politically correct crowd. They were the progressives. And I think there were 3 issues in particular on which they were concerned with these sorts of issues. One was racial equality. One was gender equality, and the third was anti-imperialism. So what I want to do is talk about each one of those in sequence here. And I first want to talk about the racial equality point. The question of why is economics called the dismal science? Now, I'm here at George Mason. Hopefully you guys know the actual answer to this question, since the person who's done the most research on this is someone who teaches in the economics department here, and that's Professor David Levy, okay? And Levy's book, How the Dismal Science Got Its Name, provides an answer to this question. It turns out we got the name the dismal science not because we're depressing, boring people, though that might be true in many cases. All right? We got the, and it's also, by the way, we didn't get the name because we go around all the time saying, oh, you can't do that, right? Though that is often very true, right? No, you can't do that. Our, economists, our job is to throw cold water on people's utopias, right? That's what we do, all right? But that's not it either. The reason is that classical liberal economists were on the good side, as it were, on the side of racial equality in the great debates over race in the 19th century. And it was the proponents of racial hierarchy, that is, those who wanted to maintain differences between the races in terms of political legal status, who referred to us, to the economists, the free market economists, as the dismal science, because the dismal part there was that we had the sort of nerve to imagine a world of equality where race simply didn't matter, right? A world of the marketplace where what mattered was the money that people were willing to spend in their transactions in the marketplace meant that we were all equal in one sense, and that we wouldn't put up with the racial hierarchies. In the great debates of the 19th century, the two groups that were in combat there were the first group we might call the conservative romantics, such as John Ruskin and Thomas Carlyle. On the other side were the classical liberals, in particular John Stuart Mill, who's often underappreciated for his role in this. Carlyle, Ruskin, and the romantics argued frequently in favor of tradition and hierarchy, and they believed that the commitment to markets, that the free market would destroy the traditional hierarchies that defined 19th century society. In particular, one of those being racial hierarchies, black and white hierarchies. The problem with the classical economists, with the classical liberals of this era, is that they treated everyone, they imagined people as being equal. What Levy refers to this as the practicing analytical egalitarianism, that our analysis assumed that people were equal. And what's interesting about this, as a little footnote, by the way, is modern libertarians don't like to talk about equality because we assume that's something that the left talks about. But one of the points that Levy's work raises is that equality has always been central to classical liberalism. Okay? That as important as liberty was, so was equality. Specifically, two kinds of equality. One, the kind of equality we're talking about here, which was assuming that people were equal for the purpose of sort of political philosophy, right? Of course, we're all different. We have different skills. Some of us are smarter, some of us aren't so smart, some of us are stronger, whatever it might be, right? No one's saying we're actually equal. But for the purposes of political philosophy and moral philosophy, we had to assume that everybody, black, white, yellow, green, whatever, were equal. That was one very important notion of equality to the classical liberals. A second was equality before the law, that everyone was equal in the eyes of the law. And that's why the classical liberals, by the way, were on the anti-slavery, were key to the anti-slavery movement, both in the UK and here in the United States, right? Because the belief was that the law should not make those distinctions between people. The law should treat all citizens equally. It still should be a value that we have today. When we think about, even as many classical liberals today think government should be doing much less than it does, it's also true that we should remember that whatever government does do, it must treat all of its citizens equally. That's a foundational part of classical liberalism, of the libertarian tradition. And it often gets lost today because we tend to not be interested in that word equality. But in the 19th century, they understood it. All right? In a world where everybody's money is green, things like race and gender become far less important. And the ability to please consumers in the marketplace replaces the old markers of status and hierarchy, right? It's not about who you knew, it's not about what race you were, or male or female. Slowly over time, the idea was that if we were all equal in terms of our standing in the marketplace, we would begin to erase those old hierarchies. And that's what Mill and other classical liberals argued about capitalism and why they thought it was good. The romantics like Carlyle and Ruskin thought this would lead to a chaotic society in which nobody knew, quote, their place, and the reference, therefore, to economics as the dismal science. It's dismal because we're imagining this world without all the old ways that people supposedly knew who was who and what was what. It was dismal because it promised a world of equality before the law in which race and other standard hierarchies, traditional hierarchies, didn't matter. They, the critics of classical liberals, thought that was a problem. We, as classical liberals, people, the classical liberals of then and now, should wear that as a badge of honor, right? The fact that we were called the dismal science. We were called it for a reason we should be proud of, because we were rejecting those racial hierarchies. At the same time, the 19th century classical liberals were also concerned with issues of gender equality, okay? And again, you don't often hear the story, but there was a very strong classical liberal feminism that was part of the feminism's first wave in the 19th century, particularly toward the end of the 19th century. There were a number of writers in the 19th century, both male and female, who made strong feminist arguments, but from a classical liberal individualist perspective. Of course, there were other feminist traditions at this time, as there are now, but there was a strong classical liberal one as well. Much of this centered around sexual issues as well as married women's rights questions. It's important to remember a couple of things about this period. One, married women didn't have many rights, particularly economic rights. For example, married women could not sign contracts or own property in most of the Western world and including the United States until really late in the 19th century. And the argument was, the historic argument in the English common law, was that when a man and woman got married, the man's identity covered the woman's. This is called the Doctrine of Culture, okay? And the idea was if you were married, the married couple, and really the whole family, were merged into the husband. So the husband had all the legal rights, the married woman had none. So married women were not sort of economically recognized as separate independent beings. The law began to change in the late 19th century, and one reason why was that classical liberals were arguing this is crazy. And in fact, the debates over women's rights were often part of the debate over slavery, as individualist feminists compared women's second-class status toward men to that of slaves against their owners, and tried to persuade abolitionist men to also sign on to the cause of women's rights. They basically said, if you men believe it's wrong for you to own African slaves, then how can you be okay with the fact that you effectively own your wife if she has no economic existence independently of you? And so one of the arguments at the time, again, for that feminism was to make this analogy to slavery and attempt to persuade people or persuade those sympathetic to abolition, the abolition movement, that they ought to be arguing for women's rights as well. Okay? I think that's important too. The other part of this story was sexual rights, and there was a whole bunch of things at the time that are worth mentioning. Okay? There was a free love movement at this time that was rejecting marriage, right out of the sort of 1960s and then today, okay? And many of that whole free love movement to some degree was a classical liberal movement, though there were other folks, there were socialists and others involved in there as well. This also included the argument that women and men should be free to buy and sell and use contraceptives. By the way, there were contraceptives at this time. They didn't get invented in the 1960s, contrary to what you might think. Okay? But in many places in the United States, it was illegal to buy or sell them. In fact, does anyone know when the Supreme Court decision that finally declared it was unconstitutional to prohibit the sale of contraceptives to unmarried people was? Anyone know? A little before Roe v. Wade. It was a lead up to Roe v. Wade. Griswold, very good, in the 1960s. Yeah, in the 1960s. So before the 1960s, I want to say 63, I think, but whatever. Okay, basically about the time I was born. Before that, all right, in Connecticut, it was illegal for you to buy a condom if you were not married. Just think about that for a minute. Okay, so that's already 1960. In the 18 whatever, right? There were again feminists, classical liberal feminists fighting this same battle. By the way, just one little interesting part about that period: voting rights were an interesting issue at the time too. There was an interesting split in the classical liberal movement between sort of the more anarchist leading folks like Lysander Spooner, who thought that women would be, in his words, better off going to the state capitals and burning the law books than working to get the right to vote. Okay? Spooner was awesome. All right? The more mainstream classical liberals, however, people like the Grimke sisters and Voltairine de Cleyre, well, I'm sorry. There were more mainstream classical liberals at the time who were arguing for that women should be treated equally by the state and that they should get the right to vote. And you had the sort of more radical folks like the Grimke sisters and Voltairine de Cleyre, as well as numerous men taking up the Spooner side. So it was a really interesting debate at the time, right, over that question: should women get the right to vote? The question was, is that the most important thing that classical liberals should be fighting for at the time? And it's, again, some fascinating history there that has not really been explored very well. The other point I want to make about the history of classical liberalism and women is that nothing's helped liberate women more than the capitalism that classical liberal ideas helped bring about. And I don't have the time to go into great detail here, but as Rachel mentioned in her introduction, I've been working on a book project and some other paper projects on sort of libertarianism in the family. And so I'm going to throw out a whole series of claims, ideas here that to sort of support this point, and you can kind of ponder them, and certainly we can talk about them in the Q&A. So how might capitalism and therefore classical liberalism have liberated women in a whole variety of ways? One of the most important is it transformed marriage from being about couples as workmates and as coverture, as we saw, to being about consent and love and contract. There's a very famous article called From Status to Contract that explores the transformation of Western societies. And marriage is a great example of this, right? And Mises points this out, by the way, in Socialism. For those who've read Socialism, you might recall, he makes this point that a society based on contract, which is capitalism, turned marriage into a contractual relationship and ended it as this kind of dominant, the world of coverture. It helped men and women see marriage as a relationship of equality. Again, it got women out from, as it were, under their husbands by ending coverture. By the way, the idea behind coverture wasn't really eliminated to the 1970s and 1980s. One of the last vestiges of that belief that the wife belongs to the husband were laws, so-called marital rape laws. Right? Until not so long ago, some states in the United States still had rape exceptions for married couples. Basically, that's it. It wasn't possible for a husband to rape his wife. All right? Why not? The argument was, well, they're married, she's implicitly consented. So whatever he does is fine. Right? Notice the echo of coverture in there, right? And in fact, in some states, as late as the 70s and 80s, until those laws were completely wiped off the book. And again, the notion that everyone's created equal, that relationship should be consensual and contractual, core to classical liberalism, were part of this process. In addition, the wealth that capitalism made possible has helped us come up with the kind of technological and market substitutes for household labor that we have, and that has enabled women to more easily enter the workplace. Whether we're thinking of the microwave or the washing machine. Anyone know how long it took to do the average family's laundry before the invention of the washing machine? Who said hours? Guess again. Put your Spock hat on. When I say hours, I mean days, right? Days. 3 days to do the average family's laundry. By the way, one of the things that would happen there is that girls would stay home to do the laundry, to help with the laundry, and have to miss school as a result of having to be home to help with the laundry. That, as you can imagine, would be a big problem. So modern technology, the wealth that capitalism created, gave us modern technology. It also made us wealthy enough to afford to buy market substitutes like, say, daycare, or eating out more often, or having someone else dry clean our clothes, or whatever it might be. That's fundamentally changed women's role in society. It also created the wealth that increased the demand for labor, that made women more valuable as employees, provided them with more market opportunities, provided them with higher wages. It also created the wealth that's enabled families to educate their children more, and especially young women. And finally, capitalism created the wealth and changed ideologies in ways, this will be a little more controversial perhaps, that made divorce both more acceptable and more feasible. And that has allowed a number of women to exit marriages that were otherwise abusive or damaging to them. That ability to get out of bad marriages more easily is a good thing. Yeah, it comes with a cost, right? But many of the costs of divorce, I would argue, are not as great as they used to be. And again, precisely because we're a wealthier society, in particular women have a kind of economic independence that they did not have before. These are all good things, I think, that classical liberalism and capitalism has done for gender equality, for women. Did the 19th century classical liberals foresee all this? Were they arguing, oh, well, markets will produce all this wealth and here's all these great things that will happen? No, but they did glimpse it. Okay? As the debate over race shows, they understood the equalizing and leveling effects of a vibrant market economy. I mean leveling in a good sense. Okay? And they glimpsed how it would, there were classical liberals who glimpsed how it would change women's roles in their relationship with men. And again, John Stuart Mill here, probably the most famous among those. If you read some of his work on the subjugation of women and so on, Mill got it. And part of it was because his relationship with Harriet Taylor was they were already, as it were, living outside the law, and he understood sort of having this partner who was a professional woman on her own about what some of those opportunities would be. Okay? So again, there's a claim there that classical liberalism has been part of this sort of progressive movement with respect to gender. The other thing I'll talk quickly about is kind of anti-imperialism. Often lost in the classical liberal tradition of the 19th century, is the role that classical liberal plays as anti-imperialist. And much of that has its roots in the late 19th century. And particularly, it actually saw a revival in the 20th century in the so-called old right in the 1930s and 1940s. One of the sort of best known of those anti-imperialist classical liberals is Herbert Spencer, the much misunderstood great libertarian of the 19th century. He was terrific on these imperialism questions, and he argued fundamentally for the equality of citizens across the globe and the immorality of our imposing by force our way of life on others in other countries. If analytical egalitarianism was good enough for human beings within the borders of the UK or the United States, it was good enough for human beings elsewhere. And again, classical liberals were on the sort of cutting edge of this kind of, for lack of a better term, sort of cosmopolitan and progressive worldview. Of course, to make the claim against imperialism, it helps, right, that when you understand the role that markets play in creating peaceful relationships between peoples and between nations. Peace is intimately linked with free trade. And the classical liberals didn't just argue that imperialist conquering was wrong, they had an alternative. They were not isolationists. They were cosmopolitans, but not at the point of a gun, rather through the free movement of goods, services, ideas, and people. As Bastiat said, where goods cannot cross borders, armies will. And conversely, where goods can cross borders, armies won't. When we trade with other people, we create interdependencies, right? We know this both at the international level and at the interpersonal level. I'm really, really dependent upon my local grocery store, okay? They provide me with stuff I really, really need. I have no desire to throw a Molotov cocktail in there and burn the place down, because if I do, I'm in big trouble. I have no groceries. I live in a very small town with one grocery store, okay? I'm very dependent upon. That's good. By the way, they're very dependent upon me. I have 2 teenage kids. I buy a lot of stuff there. Okay? So that mutual dependence leads us to treat each other well. Why do firms treat their customers well? Because they need us, right? And we respect that in return by not, wanting to destroy the things that we depend on. Same is true between individuals. The people who we trade with peacefully all the time, we have no reason to want to attack them. We gain from the trade, right? And it doesn't matter where we are geographically, across an artificial state border, an artificial national border, whatever it might be. Where goods cannot cross borders, armies will. When people start shutting down trade, that's when economic interaction changes from a positive sum game to a zero or negative sum game. And that means it's more likely that people will use force rather than trade. And a system based on trade and consent cannot be imposed on others by the point of a gun. And this is a really, I think, key issue that we need to think about too. Again, telling this story at George Mason is appropriate. Some of you may know Chris Coyne in the economics department. Chris's first book after war was about exactly this point, right? That we cannot export Western liberalism and democracy at the point of a gun. Actual trade is what makes people come to respect and desire trade. And here, as with race and gender, trade and markets are the means toward progressive ends. In this case, peace. Trade was the substitute for war and imperialism. Trade was the way we actually spread good ideas and wealth and benefited people in other countries. So those are the three key ways in which those 19th century classical liberals were in fact progressive. They were arguing for racial equality, they were arguing for gender equality, they were arguing against imperialism. And as I said at the start, I did want to say a word or two about why the progressives weren't very progressive. And one of the reasons is that many of the interventions that progressives wanted to make in the marketplace were the result of a belief in racial difference and in eugenics. As I'm going to argue in a minute, the progressives of the late 19th and early 20th century found eugenics fascinating. Many of them were deeply involved in the eugenics movement, and oftentimes that played a significant role in the kinds of arguments that they played. Let me sort of back up first, okay? Late in the 19th century began to see the split between classical liberals and what we today might call modern liberalism, with the latter, modern liberalism, taking the form of what at the time was known as the progressive movement. These were those progressives of the turn of the 20th century were the progenitors of modern American liberalism, as they largely combined the classical commitment to progress and stated concern for the poor and others with the view that these goals could best be accomplished through activist government that could scientifically manage society in ways that would achieve those goals that the classical liberals had. Much of the regulatory legislation of the late 19th and early 20th century came out of these beliefs, hence we call that the progressive era. Everything from antitrust to the Food and Drug Administration to the Federal Reserve System were products of progressivism. And this is a little footnote, particularly for the students. The Federal Reserve System was not some magical creature hatched by five guys at Jekyll Island in some conspiracy theory moment of insanity. Okay? Those of you who are my Facebook friends know this is a pet peeve of mine. All right? And by the way, if you're not a Facebook friend of mine, why not? You should be. All right? But let me just say a quick word about that. The Federal Reserve System wasn't all that much different in this way than these other things I just mentioned. They all came out of the same era, the same time period, out of the same belief that wise, good-hearted people could scientifically manage the economy and scientifically regulate behavior better than people could themselves. That with the right people in charge, we could help people who needed help. And we could deal with these things that they believed anyway that markets didn't deal with. And so the Fed was no different than all these other things that we've mentioned. Again, happy to say more about that in the Q&A. At the state level too, by the way, not just the federal level. At the state level, the progressives supported all kinds of interventionist legislation, especially things like minimum wage laws and labor market legislation that was designed to protect who they saw as the weak persons in the economy and protect them against exploitation. The general tale we hear today, and it's the high school history version of American history, is that these folks were the heroes who saved us from the ravages of laissez-faire capitalism by bringing the market under the regulatory control of the state, right? That's what the progressives supposedly did. The truth, however, is not that simple. As I suggested, many of these progressives were fascinated by eugenics. The idea that we could learn from sort of Darwinian ideas about how human beings multiply and so on, and that we could scientifically manage humanity, for lack of a better term, to make sure that the people with the strongest genetic background and the strongest ability to survived, and those who did not have the sort of capability of producing and being productive, we didn't have to care about that much. And the eugenics movement was all about how do we, again, scientifically manage. You can see how it fits right in to the progressive mindset. And what the progressives did, though, is saw that this idea, the idea behind eugenics, could be translated into public policy, particularly in labor markets, by using government intervention as a way to eliminate workers who were not that smart or not skilled enough to survive. At the time of the turn of the 20th century, this was mainly about blacks. It was mainly about racial relationships. But to a lesser extent, it was also about gender. It was about women. Okay? Just as one example, economists, of course, have long argued that minimum wage laws will harm lower skilled workers by pricing them out of the market, right? This is one of the things we teach in Intro Micro, okay? Economists have pointed out that if it's true that, say, non-whites have fewer skills in the job market because of historical discrimination or crappy schools or whatever it might be, that minimum wage laws will harm them by making it more difficult for lower skilled groups, regardless of race, right, to get an entry into the job market. So minimum wage cuts off the lower rungs of the job ladder, of the income ladder, to people without skills to justify paying that minimum wage. Classical liberals today, libertarians today, argue that's why minimum wage laws are bad, right? And, by the way, can argue against minimum wage laws on progressive grounds. Say minimum wage laws are bad because they hurt the people who need help the most, right? Who are the least well off in society. But classical liberals are mystified why modern progressives support them. And they're baffled, progressives are baffled today, classical liberals are baffled today when we're called racist for wanting to get rid of minimum wage laws, as an example. Okay? We, classical liberals, tend to assume that the progressives just don't understand the economics. Okay? There's a historical irony here, though. The original progressives at the turn of the 20th century correctly understood the economics, but liked the consequences that economists, and particularly classical liberal ones today, think are bad consequences. In other words, what the folks at the turn of the 20th century were saying is, yeah, minimum wage laws do shut out lower skilled workers from the market. That's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Because we want to shut them out of the market because they're, quote, inferior. That, again, I'm not exaggerating, and I'll give you some quotes in just a second. This is what they said, okay? So, for example, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, very well-known progressives of the early 20th century, referred to the unemployment that minimum wage laws create and said, this unemployment is not a mark of social disease, but actually of social health. Henry Rogers Seeger of Columbia University, who's an economist there, suggested that minimum wages were necessary to protect workers from, quote, the wearing competition of the casual worker and drifter, right? So the lower skilled workers were the problem that people were to be protected from. A.B. Wolfe, who would one day be one of the early presidents of the American Economic Association, wrote in the American Economic Review in 1917, quote, if the inefficient entrepreneurs would be eliminated by minimum wages, so would the ineffective workers. I'm not disposed to waste much sympathy on either class. The elimination of the inefficient is in line with our traditional emphasis on free competition. No, it's not. And also with the, I'm sorry, did I say that out loud? And also with the spirit and trend of modern social economics. There's no panacea that can save the incompetents, his word, except at the expense of the, his word, normal people. They are a burden on society and on the producers wherever they are. You can find lots of similar comments about women, and about much of the protective legislation that was designed to limit women's access to the labor market at the turn of the 20th century. It was all about keeping them in the home to raise kids and to ensure the superiority of the white race. It was always about white women. It was rarely about African American women. Also part of this movement was the idea of men should get paid a family wage, and the idea of the wage that would support a family. Basically a minimum wage argument. Why? Because that way women didn't have to work, and we wanted to protect women because they were inferior. So there's again, a historical, as I said, a historical irony here. The original progressives understood the economics, right? They just liked that it produced consequences that many of us today think are bad. And the problem, or the interesting thing, is that modern progressives are taking the same position as their intellectual ancestors who were overtly racist, and the policies they support are having the same effects as those racist ancestors, even if modern progressives today don't intend them. Again, let me be clear. I'm not saying that modern progressives are racist, okay? What I am saying is they're wrong in thinking about what the consequences of what they're doing are, but they're not intending to be racist, certainly not in the way that their forebears were. Nonetheless, the question of whether their policies have disparate racial impact in problematic ways, I think, is one that we need to think about. So again, what was interesting about the progressive era was how many of those folks were involved thinking in the eugenics movement, including, by the way, Keynes, right? But that takes us a little farther off topic here, okay, into the 20th century as well. Eventually, the eugenics movement faded away. The guy with the mustache in Germany was certainly part of that, right? Once you became associated with, actually killing millions rather than impoverishing them, then it became apparently unacceptable to hold those ideas. And today, we don't see eugenics, at least as understood this way, as being an okay thing to be interested in. So what about the claim from libertarians and classical liberals to be the real progressives? And actually, I think I'm going to skip my next slide. Part of the argument that I think we have today for being the real progressives is that the world today, thanks to capitalism, is a much better place than it used to be. I'm going to click this in a second. You're going to see the world's greatest political cartoon ever. If you got Don Boudreaux, I'm pretty sure probably has this on his office door, but I love it. You may have seen this before. It's two cavemen. Something's just not right. Our air is clean. Our water is pure. We all get plenty of exercise. Everything we eat is organic and free range, yet nobody lives past 30. Okay? Yep. So one of the things we might think about is how has it, what has what has capitalism and classical liberalism and that set of ideas kind of really done for the state, for sort of the well-being of people across the world? And what I want to argue is what Deirdre McCloskey calls the great fact. Okay? And the great fact is the following, that there are more people living longer and better lives than 200 years ago. And the reason for that is capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. There's no doubt about the great fact. The debate is over, well, what caused it and why, okay? But what I want to argue is that in fact it was markets that caused this, and I want to talk about exactly what that great fact constitutes. If we want to know how much better off we are today than we were 200 years ago, there's some ways we can look at this. We can talk about the number of people, how long people are living, and the quality of the lives, at least in terms of material goods that they're living. And we're going to focus here basically on the last 200 years. And this is all from McCloskey. What McCloskey argues is people are living better. By the best estimates that we can make, okay, people today are able to consume about 8.5 times on average what people could 200 years ago. Remember, that's an average, and this is global. So people like us in the West are doing much, much better than 200 years ago. People in other parts of the world, not as much better. But globally, across all of us, about 8.5 times better. We can purchase and consume 8.5 times more stuff than 200 years ago. Longer lives. Essentially, what's the fundamental truth here is that we have twice as many adult years for a person who makes it to age 16. And let me talk a little bit about life expectancy here for a second. Worldwide, in the last 200 years, life expectancy at birth has gone from 26 years to 66 years. Okay? That's part of the great fact. People 200 years ago, the average worldwide life expectancy at birth was 26 years. Today it's 66. Anyone know the main reason for that change? What demographic fact explains that change?
Infant mortality.
Yeah, infant mortality rates are down tremendously. Why does that matter? Well, every time a kid dies in the first year of life, that's a 0 in that average, or something less than 1, right? So that 26 years is life expectancy at birth. If half your children die before they reach the age of 1, that's going to pull down the average, right? Okay? When you start curing infant mortality, when kids actually live to 16, 18, and longer, average life expectancy goes up. So that move from 26 to 66 is mostly about the overcoming infant mortality. And I'm being a little cute about it, but don't get me wrong. That's one of the most major accomplishments in human history. I mean, we're not in a world anymore where parents had to name 3 of their kids with the same first name because odds were that maybe only one of them would make it to adulthood. All right? So that's a really different world where half of the children born alive were unlikely to make it to 18. We don't really no part of the world worries about that anymore today. Okay? We could be doing better in some places, but it's not like that. Okay? So if you want to think of it that way, the average number of adult years alive, right, has increased from 10, assuming 16 is an adult, has increased from 10 years to 50 years. Right? At 16 to 26 is 10 years, 16 to 66 is 50 years. So that's about a factor of 5. Okay? Now again, that's a high end but from the perspective of someone who makes it to the age of 16, right, life expectancy, if you made it to 16, has grown from about 40 to 70. Okay? So, in other words, if you made it to 16, you were out of the danger zone considerably. You were likely to live on average to 40 200 years ago, and today, worldwide, to about 70. Okay? So that's a difference of 24 adult years, right, 40 minus 16, to 54 adult years, roughly about 2. So if we say longer lives, somewhere between 2 and 5 is a kind of multiple for just how much longer humans tend to live these days. And if we'll take the low end, right, 2 times 8.5 would give us 17 times better life today, right, if we just look at longer and better than 200 years ago. If we took the high end and we did 5 times 8.5, that'd be 42.5. So somewhere between 17 and 42.5 times better today than 200 years ago. But we got to consider more. World population has increased from 1 to 7 billion. It's gone up 7 times. If we want to know just how much more world adult materially supplied years we have, if we want to know just how much better life is, we also have to include the fact that not only can we support 17 to 42.5 times the sort of long and better, We can do it with 7 times the people. So we need to multiply this through by 7. And that changes our range this way. If we take 2 as the low end, the world's 119 times better today than it was 200 years ago. If we take the high end, it's 297. Even at 100, we'll take the low end at 119. As McCloskey points out, that means the world's 9,000% better today than 200 years ago. That's the low end estimate, right? If we take 297, someone can do the math if they want. It's a very large number, okay? We've gone from $3 per day worth of consumption worldwide to $30 per day worth of consumption worldwide. And in the developed Western world today, $130 on average per person per day worth of consumption. Okay? That's an amazing accomplishment. And it's an accomplishment that's enabled us to have this. I love this picture. Oh my God. Okay? These are 2 Maasai tribesmen with their cell phones in the middle of nowhere. Okay? By the way, if you know anything, I mean, cell phone, this picture's a little old because a lot of Africans got better cell phones than we do now. Okay? That has been the way that technology has spread in many of those parts of the world. They don't have to build phone lines, right? We had to build phone lines first and then get cell phones. They're just building cell towers. All right? And mobile banking in Kenya is way ahead of what we do here. All right? So this is the great fact in one picture. If you want some, this is for the pictures for the humanities types, right? This is the visualization. If you're the econ types, okay. This is I'll give you kind of a minute to digest this. This is U.S. Census Bureau data. The really interesting things to look at here. If you just focus, just stay with the poor. Don't look at this. Okay, I'll stand in front of it. What this is the percentage of poor households. By the way, this is not lowest 20%. This is below the poverty line. The percentage of poor households that possess these different goods. And you can see there was 1984, 1994, and so on. I don't know, my laser is not going to work today. And then 2003, 2005. And you can see for the most part, these have grown, right? Some of them have eased back a little bit. Telephone grew, and then it fell back. Why did it fall back? Cell phone. That's half of poor households had a cell phone in 2005. 73% of poor households had at least one car in 2001. Okay? This, and let me tell you a quick story about the car. I know some of you are in Betke's class reading Grapes of Wrath, right? Okay? There's a famous story. The Soviets, hopefully he hasn't told this story. I'm smarter than he is, so he probably hasn't told this story. That's what he gets for not being here tonight. There's a famous story. The Soviets showed the movie of the Grapes of Wrath. They showed it as propaganda, right? They were trying to persuade the Soviet people how bad capitalism was. So they showed this movie where this poor family has to get in this car and drive. You know, I mean, I have to tell you the story, right? This horrible, awful thing. My daughter just had to read it for high school AP English. She said, it's the worst book ever. There's a whole chapter about a turtle. Okay? Yeah. Anyway, it is horrible. All right? But so they wanted to show this as propaganda, and they showed the film. See how bad life in America is, see how terrible it is? So they showed the film a few times, and the reaction of Soviet audiences was, wait, poor Americans have a car? They stopped showing it, okay? So this is, I mean, when we think about what the accomplishment of capitalism, right, and of the marketplace, even in its extraordinarily impure form that we live with it, right, it's done amazing things. And if you look at these last two columns, this is the average. This is all U.S. households in 1971 and 2005. And one thing to notice here is that poor Americans today live better, by many measures, than the average American family did in 1971. Okay? And if you look at the all column here in 2005, you can get a sense of just how much better off, on average, Americans are today. The students are too young to remember, but I was alive in the world of zero here, okay, where no computer, no I remember the first VCR we bought, late 70s, $900, okay? Now, can't even find one, except used, and I can't even give one away, all right? So, again, this is just one kind of piece of evidence we might bring to this. And one of the things I would point out about this, and you might say, oh, this is all stuff, but you know what? Having more material things, I think, actually makes us less materialistic. Think about how much of our existence today, certainly in the relatively better off parts of the world, revolve around everything but the material. We have more time for art, music, books, porn on the internet, whatever it is, than we've ever had before. Right? Culture is more accessible to more people, not just in the wealthier parts, but the entire world. Material productivity has made the material less important. Even Al Gore gets this when he points out that GDP weighs less than it used to be. He's right, right? We're not making as much physical stuff. We think about how many people today make a living entertaining us, each other, right? People complain about the decline of industrial production and manufacturing. It's a good thing. We don't need as many people to make more stuff, right? People are freed up to do other kinds of things rather than make physical stuff. Material wealth has also meant a cleaner world. That was a little hard to read, but we care more about our health. We're cleaner. People are cleaner, right? Any historical movie you watch, with the exception of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is the most realistic portrayal of the Middle Ages ever filmed, every other movie you watch, all you need to know about whether it's a good historical movie is look at the teeth of the characters. If they're bright, shiny teeth, they don't get it, right? People had rotty mouths for most of human history, right? We stunk, we were dirty, not so much anymore. Okay? We have more time for art, music, and all those kinds of things. And we have the technology to bring us together with them in ways that we didn't have before. And because it's an interest of mine, just think about the family too, okay? For most of human history, the family was a workplace. That's where you did work. Your relationship with other family members was about the work you did together. But now it's different. Now it's about emotional and psychological fulfillment. Wives and children have changed from being economic assets under the control of the father, boss, owner, to having an existence and dignity of their own. Even our places of work are better places than they used to be. And so I think one of the things this helps us see, right, is that the kinds of values and the kinds of things that we associate with classical liberalism, libertarianism, libertarian ideas have been responsible for producing a much better world, and a world that is more, I think, consistent with the values of modern progressives. So one last point I want to address here, which is, well, how did classical liberalism end up on the right? Okay? And the answer to this, I think, is socialism. What happened, I would argue, is that when progressivism morphed into socialism, really, again, in the early 20th century, significantly, classical liberals opposed it, and rightfully so. Socialism, though, became seen as the new progressive view, and it captured the mantle of the left. It became the left, the progressive set of beliefs, while classical liberalism was seen as clinging to the past and therefore regarded as conservative. If you read anything written in the 1920s and 30s, you'll see exactly this view that classical liberalism was clinging to the past, today turning back the clock, right? You hear that one all the time. Instead, we have to go forward, okay? And in fact, one of the people who made this argument, by the way, that classical liberalism was backward-looking, that free markets were backward-looking, and we'd progressed beyond that, was that famous progressive Herbert Hoover. Right? And by the way, he was a progressive. So I was just a commercial for myself. I was down at Cato this afternoon filming a short little video for them based on a paper I did for them about how Hoover was not laissez-faire, was not a classical liberal, but was in fact an interventionist and so on. So you can watch for that video to come out soon, which is why you should be my Facebook friend so you know these things when they come out. And at the same time that was happening, the classical liberal opponents of socialism found common cause with some traditional conservatives in their mutual opposition to socialism. And that alliance between classical liberals and old conservatives got stronger at the end of World War II with the advent of the Cold War. It's also the case by the time of the 1950s that classical liberals were few and far between, and certainly after the Great Depression and then after the war. And I think many at the time saw an alliance with the right as being the lesser of two evils and perhaps necessary for their survival. By the 1960s, though, we began to see a revival of classical liberalism, modern libertarianism. And there was a real attempt at that time to separate libertarians from the right, from conservatives, provoked to a significant degree by the Vietnam War and the draft, which were two issues that pushed libertarians to the left. If there's one thing that libertarians will not stand for at the top of our list, it's the draft, because the draft says the state owns you and can do with you whatever it wants. And that's so fundamental, I think, fundamentally objectionable to libertarians who believe in self-ownership and similar sorts of concepts. But the draft in the Vietnam War pushed many libertarians to the left and created some interesting alliances at the time, as did the civil rights movement. By the way, the Libertarian Party was the first U.S. political party to have a gay rights platform as early as, I believe, 1976. Murray Rothbard and others at the time had some briefly successful alliances with the new left of the 60s and 70s. And it looked like the 1970s might be a time when that alliance might blossom. But what actually undermined it, I think, was the Reagan presidency. Reagan's classical liberal rhetoric and the growing free market presence in the conservative movement, particularly as socialism began to collapse, led many classical liberal types to see the right as their home. 1970s libertarians, I know, I grew up with them, were very often countercultural and hippie-ish, but by later in the 1980s, the transformation to sort of mainstream, if not country club, was pretty clear. The 70s libertarians tended to be a-religious, if not anti-religious. The 80s brought more religious believers into the classical liberal movement, if not libertarianism. Now again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It just explains why we became less identified with the left and more identified with the right, because the religious folks tended to be more conservative on social issues. All of these things together pushed libertarianism to the right, particularly as the Reagan years exacerbated tensions with the Soviet Union. So all of these things, I think, pushed libertarians to the right. But what about today? That says Bleeding Heart. Yeah, I can see it there. Bleeding Heart libertarianism. What about today? Isn't that a pretty picture? Yeah, it is. The world we inhabit today is not that world. Okay? The world we inhabit today in some ways is more like the 1960s, with the wars again being a major issue, not to mention the related invasion of privacy and Fourth Amendment issues. Throw in things like same-sex marriage and technology freedom issues. Many libertarians are making common cause with people and issues that resonate more on the left. The possibilities for alliance have never been greater, and some folks like antiwar.com have been pretty successful. And I think beyond that, the way we argue for classical liberalism has shifted, with more and more people making the case that classical liberalism, a classical liberal world, is a world that better satisfies the demand for quote-unquote social justice that's normally associated with the left. You can call this Hayek's world meets Rawls, or you can call it Bleeding Heart libertarianism. You can call it just smarter, more socially concerned libertarianism. I see this in particular with young people and the Students for Liberty movement, in which their concern with issues that interest the left has been one of the most out in front things that they've been doing. Whatever you want to call it, I think it's here, and I think modern libertarians, modern classical liberals are beginning to rediscover our progressive past and rediscover that we can think of ourselves on the left in ways that we historically have not. So thank you all very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, I'm going to do Q&A now. I have the mic. If you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. The mic will not project your voice. It's just for the camera for the web broadcast. So make sure you speak loudly. Okay.
First of all, Professor, thanks for giving me something to respond to the lefties with. But the question I have to you is, how do we respond to the suggestion that all that benefit to the poor that they see in materialism is not the result of the 1960s war against poverty?
Yeah.
I mean,
That's a good question, okay? And again, all that data does not separate out what people bought with their own earnings from what they might have got through transfer programs and so on and so forth. I think the best way to respond to that is that the trends that those identify. I mean, my data doesn't go back super far, okay? It would seem odd for people on the left to argue the following two things at the same time. Poor Americans keep getting better off, and social spending isn't high enough, right? Or that Reagan killed social spending in the 80s. Well, wait a second. If he killed social spending in the 80s and the poor folks kept getting better off, perhaps it wasn't because of that. I have a different talk I do that goes through that data, and it looks at it a different way. And one of the ways you can look at it, the bottom line point is simply this. The real cost in terms of the number of labor hours it takes to purchase all of those goods has fallen dramatically over the 20th century and continues to fall. That is, that if we say how many hours of work at the average wage does it take to buy, say, a pair of jeans or 3 pounds of chicken or whatever it might be? That's gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And there's no government policy you can invoke to explain that. That's called improvements in technology on the supply side, and the fact that in the I get my data right. In the 1970s, the average private sector wage was about $4 an hour. Today, it's about $19 an hour. Workers are better educated. They got better capital. They're more productive. Their wages are higher. So I think if there's the argument over whether those social programs are a good thing or a bad thing. That's a separate argument, I think, right? And it's one that we need to entertain. But when we look over the long haul, there's just no question that markets and capitalism have produced more stuff, more cheaper stuff, driven up wages, and made the standard of living for everyone, including poor folks, and perhaps especially poor folks, better. I mean, Schumpeter said the real accomplishment of capitalism is not that it provides nylon stockings for the wealthy, but does so for the poor. Right, and the fact, here's another way to look at it. This is Tyler Cowen's made this argument, and I think it's a good one, which is, for most of human history, the difference between poor folks and rich folks was that the rich had stuff that the poor didn't have, right? And so you were rich, you had all this stuff. Poor folks, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, wallowed around in the muck, okay? The difference today, at least in the developed world, is not a difference between having it and not having it, but we all have the same stuff, just the rich have more or better. Bill Gates drives a car, most poor Americans drive a car, okay? Bill Gates may have more cars, he might have a better car, but we both have cars. And the difference between more and better, I would argue, is a much smaller difference between having and not having. And if we expand that out, Bill Gates lives in a beautiful multi-million-dollar whatever house, but you know what? It's got the same kind of refrigerator and air conditioning, and he's got a cell phone, just like most Americans, poor Americans do. Most, not all, most. So again, the differences between rich and poor, I think, are differences now, again in the West, the developed West, of differences between sort of quantity and quality, not differences in kind. So there's all kinds of things we can argue there. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hello, sir. Mm-hmm. According to what you were stating about how trade creates peace, are you implying that that why America and Iran are getting along so well is because we're not trading with one another, therefore we don't have an interest to maintain peace with one another?
I would put it this way. I think that if we were trading with one another, it becomes much more difficult to be antagonistic toward each other, right? The same way I would argue for ending the embargo against Cuba. Right? The more you trade with people, and it's important to remember who's doing the trading here. We talk in abstractions. We say the U.S. is trading with Iran, or the U.S. is trading with Korea, or whomever, South Korea. No, actually, it's people who are trading with people. Right? And so one of the ways that we can reduce tensions among people is to open things up to trade. I think one of the reasons why we've seen so many parts of the world, the Arab Spring and so on to some degree, right, and other parts of the world, democracy movements elsewhere, is that people are beginning to get exposed to Western ideas, whether it's in the form of online or video, but also Western products and Western books and so forth. And that trade of ideas, that trade of products, makes people less likely to want to makes them desire freedom and democracy more, makes them less likely to want to go to war with the very people that they're now dependent upon for these better things. It's hard to find throughout history examples of two democracies going to war with each other. It's also hard to find examples of countries going to war to each other without there having been some kind of economic nationalism precipitating it. World War I is the classic example of that. As countries began to shut their borders, hostilities got worse. I think it's pretty clear historical argument that the more people trade with each other, the less likely they are to go to war. I'm not saying that that's, I'm not denying the belligerence of Iran, okay? What I am saying is we can't, trading instead of embargoing can't hurt. It can only make things better. Yep.
Hello. I noticed earlier you mentioned Lysander Spooner and Voltairine de Cleyre, and I was just wondering, what do you think about the individualist anarchists and their relationship to the history of classical liberalism and bleeding heart libertarianism?
Wow, we could do a whole talk on that, couldn't we? Look, those guys are awesome, okay? And they were awesome because they were they were the radical leftists of their time, right? They really were, okay? And they understood, they understood that capitalism, properly understood, was pretty radical, progressive kind of doctrine. That genuinely free markets don't serve the interests of the powerful. They're challenges to the powerful. So I think all that stuff is great. And to that degree, I think that those folks, the sort of modern bleeding heart libertarians, have an interest in them because, or the even better term might be the left libertarians today. People like Kevin Carson and Rod Long and those people have an interest in them because they're trying to make those same challenges from the left, as it were. So in that sense, it's great. I think the more interesting question, there's some people who want to say those guys were not really classical liberals. They were from this different anarchist tradition. I'm not enough of an intellectual historian to make a grand argument there. I think that's a plausible argument. But I think what does happen is that in the modern libertarian movement, you get someone like a Murray Rothbard who brings those two traditions together in a way. And now I think you can't separate them anymore. Now you have to, because of Rothbard's blending of them into what became modern libertarianism, you have to in some ways treat those folks, Spooner, De Cleyre, all those folks as ancestors, even though I think at the time they were in a somewhat separate stream from, say, John Stuart Mill and others. It's a great question, and the sort of trying to figure that one out is so bound up with the way that the classical liberal movement did evolve in the 20th century. By the way, I think we should mention, so much of modern classical liberal libertarianism post World War II is defined by the kind of, what's the word I want here, strident individualism of a Rothbard and an Ayn Rand. Okay, that we, I think, have forgotten that that's a recent thing in classical liberalism. If you go back and read the 19th century classical liberals, they, with a few exceptions, most of them were not sort of this kind of, again, strongly, stridently individualistic. They had a much, I think, more subtle conception of the individual. Again, most of them did. And they understood how individuals are placed within social structures and all that. And I think modern libertarianism is rediscovering that in some ways after this detour I think we took in the post-World War II era. And maybe that detour was necessary given the pushback against the kind of collectivism after, in mid-century. But it's now, I think we're seeing again a swinging back the other way. It's a really interesting time to be thinking about these things. Again, bleeding heart libertarianism, Students for Liberty, all these things have made me more hopeful about recapturing some of that progressivism. I think even, I'm wandering a little bit, but I think another good sign is how many people in the Republican Party are worried about the fact that more young Republicans just don't care about social issues anymore. Right? They're just not important. And many of them are, say, pro-gay marriage or whatever, but they just don't want to talk about it. They're more interested in the economic issues. Something's got to give there eventually. That's not a stable equilibrium, right? And it's a good sign. I think that young people are trending libertarian, we might say. Yes, sir.
I think one can fairly easily make a case that there's, in many ways, more diversity of perspective within the classical liberal tradition than within or between either the right wing or left wing of typical Western politics. So as classical liberalism expands, if it expands to cover a wider portion of the population, to what extent do you see classical liberalism fragmenting more, either along right-left lines or totally different lines?
Wow. Speculation time. I don't know. I mean, I guess here's my glib, snarky answer, which is, you know what? If we get to that point, that'll be a great problem to have, right? I mean, in some ways it is. It means, I guess that's my answer in this sense. I think that would be a sign of a mature intellectual movement, right? That there's change and there's new ideas and that people are thinking about things differently. I mean, and if we are a classical liberal, what a wonderful world it would be where the big political divide was between sort of right libertarians and left libertarians, right? Pick whomever you think best, sort of reflects that in your own head. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think you need. I mean, what you kind of hope happens is at least there's a kind of middle that everybody can grab onto. There's enough set of beliefs that everyone agrees with that you still have a movement, you still have a coherent set of ideas, even though there are all these kind of diverse paths one can take off it. And frankly, I do think we're seeing some of that already, right? We're the voluntarist movement, for example. All these kinds of things are different. There's, you're cool when everyone wants to call themselves a libertarian, even when they're not, right? Bill Maher's not a libertarian, all right? But grab it, baby, because So that's, I think, an interesting thing. I mean, I do think that young people. What I can see with young people is that there is a trend there, and it may take a form that it may look very different than the libertarianism I grew up with, right? So be it, right? I mean, it would be ironic to try to centrally plan the libertarian movement, right? So whatever's going to happen, it's going to evolve how it's going to evolve, and I hesitate to predict where it's going to go. I think the one thing I can feel pretty comfortable about is that I think the days for young libertarians, when I was in college in the 80s, sometimes you couldn't tell apart the young libertarians and the young Republicans. And that's because the libertarians were more like them. I think those days are gone. I think younger libertarians are marking themselves out more distinctly in a whole bunch of ways. And even this debate, the intern debate, right, that Cato and Heritage have every summer or whatever, is a good sign, right? Because that is young libertarians trying to say, you know what, we're not those guys, we're something different. And I think social issues have a big thing to do with that. I think the same-sex marriage issue is a galvanizing one for many young people. Again, my daughter is 16. For her, that's the most important issue there is, which I find fascinating at age 16, but it's my kid. What can I do? All right. And for her, by the way, that's a great. She loves Gary Johnson because of that too, right? So she had to watch the debate last week or 2 weeks ago, the presidential one, as a school assignment. And she's watching the debate, but she's got her laptop out watching Gary Johnson's Google Plus hangout where he was responding to all the questions as the other two went along. So again, I mean, I think it's young people are going to define it, and I think they're going to define it more to the left than it's been.
Any other questions?
I'd like to ask about two of my favorite classical liberals, Lord Acton and Gladstone. Where do you think they fit into progressivism? Because they did oppose war, but they both opposed war from Edmund Burke, and they both did expand the franchise, but Disraeli also did expand the franchise, so I don't know where they fit.
Acton and Gladstone. I know more about Gladstone than I do about Acton. I think that those two kind of represent what I would call a sort of British Tory classical liberalism. It is more towards the conservative end. I don't think they quite fit as much. They were also, if I have my dates right, Gladstone, right, was a little earlier, right? 18? No, I guess so I guess he wasn't. Yeah, he would have been about the same time then. That's a really interesting question. I think they had less of that claim than perhaps a John Stuart Mill did and others. And I think they still were dispositionally conservative in a certain sort of way. But I'm hesitant to say too much because I just don't know enough about either one of them. But that would be there's a great undergraduate thesis paper right there. Acton and Gladstone as classical liberals, yeah. Write it.
Any other questions?
Other questions?
Since you did bring up Gary Johnson, how much do you think he fits into bleeding heart libertarianism?
Wow. I think the thing I'd say about Gary Johnson is, one, he's not his positions aren't as hardcore as many libertarians, right? But I do think he fits this argument because he has chosen to emphasize the social issues in a way that previous LP candidates haven't always. I mean, he's, again, the same-sex marriage being one, but the marijuana issue being another. I think of that as being a social issue. Internet freedom has been a big part of his campaign. He has made the efforts to reach out to non-whites, to women. So I think all of those things those are in the spirit of the argument I'm making. So I think in that sense he does. I guess one could argue he's more bleeding heart than libertarian in that, because some of his economic positions, I'd like him to be a little more radical than he is. But I think if you're going to play the political game, you have to be within the ballpark of reasonable realism. So I think, you know, my expectations might be too high. And the other thing is, I mean, he's not, no one would look or know much about Garry Johnson and think, there goes a kind of conservative country club Republican. I mean, the guy climbs mountains, right? I mean, he's, you know, and he's a pot smoker, or at least was anyway, and said so. So he's got a little different vibe to him, one that seems to fit the story I've told tonight more than others do. So yeah. Yeah.
Can I just ask for a clarification of
Sure.
the remark? You said classical liberals made a detour by focusing on Rand and Rothbard. I guess what does that mean?
I think the detour in the sense that historic, those two, well, I mean, you can make a whole bunch of different arguments. Those two, in their own separate, though similar in some ways, made the classical liberal argument a kind of primarily, and this is true of Rothbard too, philosophical one, emphasizing things like self-ownership and a kind of very strong conception of the individual. I mean, Rand, you know, largely rejected, you know, sort of said that things like family and so on just weren't that important. Rothbard did that in other ways. And so I think they, you know, this sort of starting with the fairly self-contained vision of an individual and building a system upon that was very different. I mean, that's not what we see in Mises, who rejected natural rights altogether. And you go back even farther than that, that's not the way people like Mill and others in the 19th century, not all of them, most of them, sort of, you know, not the vision of classical liberalism that they had. It's a detour in that sense, whether I think it was a detour that was understandable at the time, though those had mixed effects. There wouldn't be modern libertarianism without Rand, that's for sure, because that's how so many people became interested, and to an extent Rothbard too. On the other hand, I think, I wish we could get away from some of that, what I think of as excessive kind of focus on the individual. But again, it may well have been necessary at the time. So that's the sense in which it was a detour. The people before them didn't argue that way, okay, and they took us in a certain direction, which had some good effects. I also think it had some problematic effects, and we're, I think, seeing a swing back from that in the last 10 or 15 years. So that's what I was trying to argue there.
We have time for about one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry,
Get your second round in, yeah.
Yes, actually, and I really appreciate again your speech. But the third issue that you spoke of was imperialism, and you only touched on the draft. And the fact is, the United States has a drone war in Libya. They're bombing Somalia. They're bombing all over the world.
Thank you for using they instead of we, by the way.
Well, I mean, but that's the fact that the government, and
Yes.
by the way,
Thank
I
you.
agree with you that if we can trade with each other, we don't need the government, which is what I guess Lysander Spoon would say.
Yeah,
but the fact is, with that, I mean, to me, is such an important thing that is bringing the young people to this movement, because they all disagree with it, and our government does not reflect what the people want. And the other thing I'd like to say is, I really would ask you to please look into alternative information about Iran, because that's just the next war that they want to take us to get us out of this bogus recession thing.
Yeah. Well, I think all those are really important points. I mean, on the war thing, I do think it's, again, I think of my own students, it's hard for young people to get their heads around, and good for them, why it is that we're killing all kinds of innocent women and children and watching 14-year-old girls get shot in the head for wanting to read. We didn't do that, but you know, that's all part of the big picture. And the drone war thing in particular too, I think, you know, when that's just downright scary, particularly now we start to see them being used domestically for other kinds of purposes. So yeah, I agree with you. And if you know, the interesting question for me is, at what point will we go one step so far that young people rally in a way that they haven't? I think the 60s were different because of the draft. It was personal. right? If you were going to be sent, imagine, I look at my young friends here, male and female, if you were going to be sent off to fight in Afghanistan or Iran, because the lottery number came up right, you might be out there protesting the war a little bit more overtly. So I think that's part of it. There's still a sense that, yeah, it's bad, but it's someone else's problem. At what point will I think young people say, you know what, it's now our problem? I hope it doesn't take another attack on U.S. soil to do that. The other thing worth noting here too is whatever did happen to the anti-war movement, if you're not much of an anti-war movement when it's okay if your guy does it, right? That goes both ways, by the way, because if Romney wins and we keep doing it, which we will, right? Anyone who criticized Obama from the right for doing it better be still criticizing. I doubt it's going to happen. So yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's amazing to me, particularly that conservatives who claim to be skeptical about the government's ability to deliver first-class mail on time still have this amazing confidence in the intelligence they gather and their ability to fight a war in a country that we know nothing about. So that's and I'll whack both sides while I'm at it. And for the left to sit by in silence when Obama does everything Bush did and worse is unforgivable too. So there's my radical bash everybody ending tonight. All right. So thank you all very much for coming.